Hello, I am Martin Phillips, Professor of Human Geography at the University of Leicester. I'm also a member of the Programme Coordination Team for the UKRI's Landscape Decisions Programme, and in this brief presentation I want to highlight some themes and raise some questions relating to 8 of the video presentations that have been created by members of networks funded as part of this programme. As several of the presentations have mentioned, many of the networks funded in this programme were effectively just getting started when the COVID-19 outbreak began in the UK and the government instigated a series of spatial distancing and other measures. These have entailed many planned activities, including workshops that the Programme Coordination Team had planned as a way of bringing project teams together to share ideas and insights. Just as many of these network teams have had to adapt approaches and activities, so have the programme team, and we have sought to move our discussions online through a series of presentations and discussions, which have been grouped into one of the 5 themes as shown in this slide. My role in this presentation is to act as a sort of discussant for the presentations grouped under Theme 4, which was focused around assessing how the arts, humanities and social sciences can contribute to landscape decision making and inform landscape decision making models and tools. These themes were set up as quite general overarching ones that might only potentially connect to the networks and projects within the Landscape Decisions Programme, which had their own quite specific aims and objectives, as is clearly demonstrated by the presentations given within this theme. Hence we have presentations that range across quite abstract notions such as aesthetics and ethics, the involvement of art and artists in landscape and environmental research, community empowerment and landscape decision making, the role of design innovation in decisions over land assets, through into quite specific and very material concerns, such as the future of infrastructures of carbon energy production as the UK and elsewhere seek to transition to a post-carbon society, the management and community responses to flooding, and the reconstruction of past vegetated landscapes. However, across this diversity of networks, some connecting themes and issues can be discerned. I was, for instance, struck by how many of the presentations touched on issues of landscapes in the past, present and future, and the relations between these. There were, for instance, networks seeking to reconstruct past landscapes and landscape change over time through harnessing emerging techniques in the present, but also several cases where the past was being examined to see if it could shed light on issues in the present and near future, asking such questions as, can we learn from how past communities responded to or were treated during periods of environmental and socio-economic landscape change? There was also clear recognition across many of these networks that significant landscape change will be required in the future, with many of the transformations needed to manage and adapt to these changes requiring actions to be taken in the present and near future. There were also several references to the need to recognise that landscape change will involve loss as well as new formations, and hence sensitivity to people's often very emotion-laden investments in landscapes of the present and traditions of the past should be an important consideration within landscape decisions about the future. Opportunities to further consider the implications of the complex relations between past, present and future being examined within these networks might be a useful development for the programme overall. As you might expect, given my disciplinary background, I was drawn to considering some of the geographies surrounding these networks. As indicated by this map, the networks ranged from the north of Scotland through to the south of England. Many had quite a local or regional focus, with some focusing down to quite specific sites, such as former collieries and power stations. Other networks had quite a national focus. There are, for instance, 2 networks with a cross-Scotland focus, and a UK-wide network exploring the role of art and artists in landscape and environmental research for decision makers. The range of scales of the networks may clearly provide scope for potentially upscaling some of the discussions and findings from the local studies through connecting with the more nationally focused networks. And this is something I would encourage all the investigators to consider. There is also a strong cluster of networks in Scotland, where there are both 2 national scale networks and a more locally focused one. From the presentations, it is clear that there are also common threads across these 3 networks. For instance, in relationship to the emphasis given to land ownership and struggles around this, to the idea of land as an asset, and community-level decision-making. Again, there would seem to be plenty of scope for information exchange and co-learning between these networks. There are also a couple of networks in the southwest, although their foci are rather different, so there may be less scope for integration between these. Given the geographical spread of the networks, it may also be useful at a programme level to have some discussions about the significance of local context on the development of networks. It was, for instance, noticeable example, that whilst all the Scottish-based networks referred to issues of land ownership, this was much less prominent in the presentations relating to England. This is perhaps not surprising, given the history and contemporary saliency of land ownership issues and struggles in Scotland, but it may be useful to consider the extent to which the ideas emerging in this context could generate ideas and insights of value to studies in other contexts. Cross-contextual comparisons, as well as intra-contextual discussions, may hence be of value. A further feature of the networks presented within this thematic grouping was that there was a very strong focus on rural locations. While a couple of presentations do raise questions about this rural focus, it may be worth reflecting on why this rural focus has emerged, what its implications might be, and whether the programme coordination team should consider actions to develop discussions of landscape decisions in more urban contexts. As well as geographical clusterings, it is also possible to identify clusterings of networks in terms of the disciplinary perspectives and approaches that they are adopting. When listening to the presentations, it appeared that a majority of the networks involved a combination of creative arts and historical and humanities research. Many also seem to involve some digital element, such as drawing on approaches and technologies developed within the digital humanities, or GIS, or involving some specialist analysis or visualization techniques, such as modeling or natural language processing. Many other projects also just talked about using the web and social media to build networks and disseminate materials. Many of the networks involve two or more of these three clusters, with terms like cross, inter, transdisciplinarity being used to promote interactions within and across these clusters. Clearly, the creative art and historical and humanities research have long had close associations with each other, not least in terms of often being grouped together in disciplinary clusterings like faculties. As such, these engagements may be seen to be quite disciplinary close collaborations. The presence of the digital might be seen as constituting rather different forms of interaction, although references to notions such as the digital humanities does indicate that there may be some institutional backdrop and support for interactions between the creative arts, historical and humanities research, and digital methodologies. There were, however, a few networks seeking academic connections beyond the triad of creative arts, historical and humanities research, and digital methods, with there being some networks involving natural and environmental scientists, including botanists, geologists, and ecologists. Such networks that seek to develop collaborations which cross the science, arts, humanities boundary are clearly of relevance when considering how the arts and humanities might inform landscape decision models and tools, given that these often originate out of environmental and other science perspectives. Less obvious were connections between the arts and humanities and the social sciences, although it should be noted that in some disciplines, such as geography and history, there is considerable internal overlap between the humanities and social science research. This having been said, it did appear from the presentations that social science research was relatively marginal to the development of these networks. This clearly may reflect the source of funding for these particular elements of the Landscape Decisions Programme, which was the AHRC, although this does not necessarily explain why there appear to be greater connections being made with environmental and digital sciences than with the social sciences. It might be worth considering the implications of the marginal presence of social science across these networks, particularly in relation to the study of decision making, which is clearly a major issue for the programme to consider. A few of the presentations did include references to involving social sciences and rural development and policy specialists, with these instances being strongest in the Scottish cluster of networks. This again raises questions about the significance of the geographical context in the development of these networks, and about the value of cross-contextual reflections. As well as considering the relative significance of disciplines within networks, it is also important to consider the different disciplinary dynamics that emerge within collaborative teams. Zirazzi et al., for instance, have differentiated multidisciplinary projects into science-led, arts-led, and collaborative projects, based around the dynamics established within disciplinary participants. They argue that these dynamics produce both different ways of integrating the arts and humanities with science, and also quite different outputs. In science-led projects, for instance, the concepts, language, and overall framing of projects are established by science. Whilst there may be a stated intention to integrate arts and humanities research, their contribution is often seen to lie largely in making seemingly difficult data accessible, or in supplying illustrations to help the communication of the essentially science-produced findings. This approach can be seen in many framings of the relationships between arts and humanities research and science-based landscape decision-making models and tools. The arts and humanities are positioned as providers of new, perhaps more qualitative data that can be used as further inputs into models, or they may be seen as providing more user-friendly tools or other outputs. Sirazzi et al. Argue that this is a very diminished view of the contribution of arts-based research, and highlight how multidisciplinary research that is arts-led produces a much more expansive view of the contribution that arts and humanities research might make. In such projects, the creative arts and humanities lead the design and running of projects, often through the use of metaphors and concepts to frame its design, as opposed to a problem-focused approach that often animates a science-led project. They also argue that these projects often make greater use of a range of art forms and techniques, and consequently often act to foster new perspectives on issues, or reveal facets of situations that have hitherto been rather overlooked, including the experience of marginalized groups and multi-sensory ways that people engage with situations. Sirazzi et al. Also argue that these perspectives often act to share and open up specialized knowledges to wider audiences, not only through translating scientific knowledges into more accessible forms, as desired in the science-led model, but also through bringing other issues such as personal experiences, aesthetics, and emotion to the fore. Finally, Sirazzi et al. Identify collaborative research that often involves a co-creative partnership of equals, drawn from the arts and humanities and other disciplines, where there are a diverse set of inputs right from the onset of the project, which they suggest produces new practices and forms of knowledge. There clearly is a risk that this third form of project development becomes viewed as the ideal form, which may actually undervalue the other two forms of multidisciplinary working, and also neglect the significant challenges that may exist in producing what has variously been described as inter, post, trans, or indeed undisciplinary projects. The very range of titles used to describe such working should alert us to their complexity and the possibility that intentions do not always correspond with practice. The challenges of such projects has indeed been well documented. Across a research program such as Landscape Decisions, it may be argued that it is sufficient to have a range of science and arts-led cross-disciplinary research projects, plus some level of cross-project synthesis and co-working. Whilst within this thematic set of presentations there were clearly some networks that explicitly ascribe themselves as being inter- or transdisciplinary. Given the strong focus on the intersection of creative arts and historical and humanities research, I think that the majority of these networks within this particular theme might well fit into the category of being arts-led, although there were a couple that appear to be science-led. It would perhaps be useful for projects to consider how best to describe their multidisciplinary character and the internal dynamics of how they are drawing together people from different disciplines, and how this is going to play out in relation to their outputs and impacts. There is also perhaps scope for the program coordination team to look how it might work to facilitate interactions and synthesis across science and art-led projects. The presenters in this theme were asked to consider what their networks might be saying about landscape decision-making, and looking at the presentation that addressed this question, I think it's possible to discern three broad visions of this. First, there were quite frequent references to some aim relating to influencing landscape decision-making through informing landscape policymakers, practitioners and stakeholders via the dissemination of research outputs. These included the provision of data and other information linked, in some instances, to the notion of evidence-based decision-making. There were also references to informing landscape decision-making through the provision of relevant and accessible summaries of key findings of the research, with creative and digital methods often being used to assist in this. The creation of tools and guides was also often promoted as helping inform decision-making by policymakers and others. Common to these activities appears to be a sense that the contribution of the programme to landscape decisions centrally involves the provision of further, better, or better presented information. Other presentations frame their contributions more in relation to influencing landscape decision through raising awareness of differences in how people view, experience, or use landscape, and associated variations in the perspectives, framings, and valuations that are associated with these. There were also some networks that were clearly aiming to raise awareness amongst decision makers about different cultures and practices of making decisions. I think that this is a really important issue for the programme, and one where the social sciences and arts and humanities can make a really significant contribution. Whilst the notion of evidence-based decision making that underpins the informed strategy is clearly significant, I think it is important that the Landscape Decisions programme recognises and investigates how people often make decisions on the basis of things other than evidence. People often, I think, make decisions on habit, emotion, gut feelings, and whether the information they're being given corresponds to their existing views and concerns, and indeed to those of people around them. Decisions are also often taken in quite different ways. Sometimes they are made individually, sometimes in a group, and sometimes through some explicitly collective decision-making practice, including participated co-productions or democratic decision-making. It was very evident from the presentations that some of the networks are seeking to raise awareness of these different forms of decision-making practice. Although I think it's also important to recognise that there are new and very powerful forms of decision-making emerging in relation to landscapes that may have very different dynamics and effects. I'm thinking here of the rise of a suite of new smart technologies that employ a range of decision-making algorithms about which many so-called decision makers arguably have very little awareness or power to change. There are also studies that sought to provide some more permanent reminders of differences through the provision of some form of legacy production, such as artworks or guides that people may encounter well after the end of the project. I think this is also another really significant dimension of these networks, and is something the program coordination team perhaps needs to reflect on so as to maximise the impacts of the projects and networks in the program. Is there a need, for instance, to establish some form of program-wide curation of the creative outputs being produced across the program? A third form of influencing landscape decisions seems to be to work with landscape decision makers. In these presentations, this seems to be framed principally as involving the continuation or development of new collaborative working partnerships. Here, I think it would have been useful to have heard more about how the existing collaborations were established and were working out as the projects developed, particularly in the light of the COVID-19 outbreak. I've only been able to briefly touch on a series of issues raised by these set of very interesting presentations. I'd like to briefly conclude thanking all of the presenters for their work in creating these presentations and giving us insight into the focus of their networks. Individually, all of the projects outlined were extremely interesting, and collectively I think they have the potential to generate valuable insight on how inter- and transdisciplinary research involving creative art and humanities research, along with contributions from other disciplines and a range of non-academic practitioners and stakeholders, can inform, influence, and work with landscape decision makers. I'm really looking forward to learning more about their future development and outputs. Thank you.